When is a feminist not a feminist? Well, how about when they're fighting to restrict bodily autonomy and overturn informed consent, as with Kellie-Jay Keen, who is the topic of today's video. Though before we can get round to her, I just need to give a content warning for the following topics: transphobia, misogyny, fascism, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, Islamophobia, gun violence, terrorism, abortion access, and attempted suicide. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media like Twitter and Discord.
My idea from now on is that maybe we need to repeal Gillick.
Kellie-Jay Keen, more commonly known by her online persona of Posie Parker, is an anti-feminist with a passion for working alongside and promoting fellow far-right voices, such as neo-Nazi Stephen Yatesy Lennon, also known as Tommy Robinson, and Holocaust denier Hans Johansson. Ms. Keen has had a profound impact on Nazi politics. In fact, she could even be credited for UK Nazis switching up their recruitment tactics in recent years, shifting focus from absurdly presenting every Muslim as a terrorist sleeper to asserting the fictional dangers posed by trans folk, particularly trans women. Ms. Keen likes to fan the flames of trans misogyny with her own ignorance, helping cultivate a climate of fear and hostility that makes for fertile pickings. She also sets out to try and make trans people feel unsafe in public, as with her woman posters and t-shirts, which give the dictionary definition of a woman intended to exclude trans women. Except it doesn't. Trans women are also adult human females, and that's not just my opinion, that's the perspective of the Endocrine Society, which in 2017 published its Clinical Practice Guidelines, co-sponsored by the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, the American Society of Andrology, the European Society for Pediatric Endocrinology, the European Society of Endocrinology, and finally the Pediatric Endocrine Society, in which it referred to trans women as transgender females and trans men as transgender males. Same for the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Committee on Adolescent Healthcare. So not exactly the win Ms. Keen seems to believe it is. It only causes distress because of its association with her bigotry. Then again, her deal isn't having a coherent argument, it's reminding trans people that they're being targeted. The same basis also motivated Ms. Keen's Heart JK billboards, which alienated trans people by glorifying known bigot J.K. Rowling. And why wouldn't she? Transphobe? Racist? Anti-Semite? J.K. Rowling represents everything Ms. Keen and her friends stand for. The only way Rowling could be any better would be if she were a man, but then she'd lose her only justification for the absurd claim that this multi-millionaire speaks to your average working class woman, the majority of whom actually support trans people having the right to self-identify. Ms. Keen has also told cis men in the US that they should start entering women's bathrooms as a means of terrorizing trans folk, as I'll show you in a second. But I wanted to draw your attention to something she does very close to the start of this clip, and that's the fact that Ms. Keen draws specific attention to the fact that the men she's talking to might be carrying a firearm.
Had a bit of an idea about some of the things that you can do. And men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. Maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife. Maybe you have a sister. Maybe you just have some friends. Maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. I think you should start using women's toilets, men, because you have every right to self-identify. Clearly don't do it and upset women and girls that are already in there, but just make a point of doing it and maybe make the women feel okay about you doing it if you come out and you frighten someone. But it's about time that you started using women's toilets and saying that you identify as a woman if stopped. And I think that's how you're going to have to, that's one of the many ways that you are going to have to combat the insanity of self-ID. Even if it's not called self-ID, that's pretty much what you have now in the United States, and that's how you men are going to help. And there's going to be no excuses, and you either care about the women and girls in your life or you don't. But you are going to start inserting yourselves into spaces that are specifically for women and girls. Maybe you're going to do it when you go to your kids' school and they've had to inject this federal nonsense of accepting boys into girls' spaces. Maybe you need to make a point of saying to the head teacher that you're going to go and use the toilet and ask where the girls' toilets are. And you're going to make this really embarrassing for everybody who's going along with it. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't.
Ms. Keen has of course removed the original stream from YouTube, and it's very easy to see why. She's very clearly implying the idea that gun violence is an acceptable means of denying trans people the right to exist in public. This is why we say the recent calls for violence by Lily Cade are not extreme for members of the gender-critical ideology. This stuff has been happening for years. Suffice to say, Ms. Keen puts an extortionate amount of time and effort into trying to make the lives of trans people worse whilst lining her own pockets. This includes propagating misinformation about trans youth and puberty blockers to try and strip trans folk of essential healthcare. Which brings us rather nicely to the Bell v Tavistock case and how recent developments have led Ms. Keen to openly acknowledge that she wants to demolish Gillick, a medical standard that predominantly protects young women in a desperate bid to hurt transgender youth. So let's get down to business, starting with a rundown of the Bell v Tavistock case so far. Bell v Tavistock was a court case launched way back in October of 2019 against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, which is England's largest provider of transgender services, including services for transgender youth. The case was brought against Tavistock by Mrs. A, the mother of a 15-year-old who's currently on the waiting list for their first appointment. In spite of the teen never having seen the inside of the building, let alone having been suggested any sort of treatment, Mrs. A feared the teen would be put on puberty blockers and argued that it was impossible for someone under the age of 16 to consent to such a treatment. Puberty blockers are a group of medications that suppress the body's natural testosterone or estrogen, preventing puberty until their removal, at which point puberty resumes as normal. They were first developed for children who suffered early onset puberty, primarily as a means of sparing the child the psychological anguish that accompanied going through puberty that early. And in spite of having been used to help said children for several decades, with the medications having gone through extensive clinical trials, there are no known adverse effects and they are thus considered perfectly safe, medically speaking. This led some brilliant doctors familiar with the medications to realize that they could also be used to improve the lives of thousands of trans people globally with no real risk, sparing trans youth the psychologically distressing process of going through the wrong puberty, as well as potentially reduce the amount of surgery they may require in future in order to achieve certain results. You don't need to remove breast tissue if it wasn't there to begin with, and you don't need to shave back a prominent larynx if it was never extended. So considering all this, the medication's history, the clinical trials they underwent, and how well established they are, it makes zero sense for Mrs. A to worry about her child being put on them, since, by definition, they're known not to cause any harm. It's actually quite the opposite. They prevent harm by giving the youth more time to make an informed decision, whilst reducing the amount of surgery they might require should that be a path they decide to pursue in future. It's also worth noting that the average wait time for a first appointment with an NHS gender specialist is between 33 and 36 months. 3 years. Though there are some records of some trans youth having been made to wait for just shy of 6 years. That means Mrs. A's teen would be older than 16 by the time of their first appointment, putting them beyond the age of full medical consent in the UK. And yet, as if Mrs. A's case wasn't absurd enough, she'd later be joined by Kira Bell, a detransitioner who went on puberty blockers age 16 and underwent a double mastectomy age 20. Why the courts allow someone who was legally considered an adult when they transitioned to be a claimant in a case about youth transitioning, I don't know. But it really shows just how void their arguments are. The anti-trans lobby couldn't find a single relevant case to support their fear-mongering. Sadly, the court ignored the medical evidence presented, ruling that under 16s couldn't consent to puberty blockers. In addition, they ruled the same was true of under 18s, meaning that 16 and 17-year-olds would have to obtain court approval in order to medically transition. Again, this is in spite of the fact that, in the UK, the age of full medical consent is 16. In other words, a UK court had declared trans citizens second class, denied the same rights and dignity as their cis peers. We have already seen this style of discrimination targeted at the LGBT+ community in how the age of consent for sex between men was set at 21 in 1967, then 18 in 1994, before finally being equalised to 16 in 2001. Except this is 2020, almost 2 decades on, and it was backsliding, stripping trans folk of rights they previously held. As a direct result of the ruling, the NHS shut down all medical services for trans people under 18 with immediate effect, leaving thousands of trans youth and adults, including those who had been on the waiting list for years, adrift and looking to grey market alternatives. The court had not only stripped trans folk of the medical autonomy enjoyed by cis folk, denying trans people vital care, but they'd pushed many into the much riskier field of self-medication. In the same way as abortion, you can't really ban medical transition, you can only ban safe medical transition. Thankfully, the ruling was overturned this year, with the Court of Appeal finding numerous examples of where the previous court had failed in its duty. For example, by ruling in direct contradiction to its own conclusion, with paragraph 56 reading, quote, "The Divisional Court accepted that children under 16s and young people aged between 16 and 18 could, under proper interpretation of Gillick, consent to embarking on a course of puberty blockers. It was lawful for Tavistock to refer such patients to UCH or Leeds, and for those trusts to prescribe puberty blockers following informed consent from the child. There was no legal obligation to seek a best interest ruling from the court." End quote. They also called out the survivorship bias at the core of the argument in paragraphs 64 and 74 about puberty blockers resulting in further medical treatment. Survivorship bias refers to a logical failure to account for the selection process your data has gone through, leading to a faulty conclusion. In this instance, it was the argument that puberty blockers are a cause of medical transition because most youth who are put on puberty blockers go on to medically transition. This is a position that has been promoted by Ms. Keen both leading up to and throughout the trial. This of course ignores the fact that the reason they're put on puberty blockers to begin with is because they're trans and they show signs of gender-related body dysphoria. It'd be like arguing that early stage cancer treatment should be banned since many people who try them sadly go on to require late stage cancer treatments. It's a conflation of cause and effects that ignores a shared underlying cause, in this instance being trans, displaying how the argument only works in the mind of someone who has already assumed that trans people don't exist. Another issue the Court of Appeal noted was the way in which Gillick competence had been warped by the original court in order to support its conclusion, namely what it meant by teens needing to understand, quote, "the immediate consequences of the treatment in physical and psychological terms," end quote. Basically, in spite of there being zero evidence to support the notion that puberty blockers impact fertility, this was one of the immediate consequences listed, partly on pure speculation about as of yet unseen effects, partly as a result of the previous argument. After all, puberty blockers cause a person to pursue HRT and surgery, and those things impact fertility, ergo, that's an immediate consequence. Or at least that's how the argument goes. However, on top of failing to back itself up with evidence, said belief also fails to acknowledge that puberty blockers are turned to as a means of preserving fertility. How? Well, the fact remains that gender dysphoria and the anxiety and depression it results in kills people. Denying trans youth essential support, including medical care, effectively trying to force them to be cisgender, increases the proportion of trans youth who have attempted suicide in the past year from 8% to 57%. Little known fact, dead people cannot have children. Some might say that's just basic biology. Thus, the only alternative would be to start trans youth on HRT in place of puberty blockers, something that actually carries with it permanent physical changes, including a risk of infertility. What this shows us is that puberty blockers are the compromise. They are the solution to concerns about dropping fertility. Puberty blockers give a person 4 more years to make an informed decision about whether they'd like to start HRT or not. This not only takes most people past the age of full medical consent, but also gives them 4 years of doctor's consultations to help them thoroughly understand the decision they're making. Presenting infertility as an immediate risk of puberty blockers flies in the face of the very reason they're prescribed to trans kids in the first place. These are but a few of the many flaws with the original ruling that are discussed to varying degrees in the appeal, which again completely overturned the original ruling. I don't have time to do them all, but thought it helped to cover a few of the big ones that stuck out to me. Of course, as one might expect, transphobes like Ms. Keen aren't too happy about the ruling being overturned. In fact, Ms. Keen has personally declared war on Gillick competence. Gillick competence, sometimes known simply as Gillick, is a medical standard from England and Wales that declares, quote, "As a matter of law, the parental right to determine whether or not a minor child below the age of 16 will have medical treatment terminates if and when the child achieves sufficient understanding and intelligence to understand fully what is proposed." End quote. The standard first arose during the Gillick v West Norfolk and Wishbeck era Health Authority case of 1985, in which a Catholic woman by the name of Victoria Gillick tried to sue the UK Department of Health and Social Care for advising doctors that they could prescribe contraception to under 16s at their discretion. Mrs. Gillick argued that prescribing contraception was illegal because the doctor would be committing the offence of encouraging sex with a minor. She of course lost her case, with the House of Lords issuing the standard that became known as Gillick competence being adopted into law in England and Wales. Scotland would quickly follow suit with their own version, same for Australia, Canada and New Zealand shortly thereafter. This was a major win for feminism, with teen pregnancy, something that predominantly impacts teenage girls, being associated with a lower quality of life. Not only does it carry with it an obvious physical and financial burden many teens aren't equipped to take, but there's also these psychological complications. Pregnancy is a very stressful experience. There's a reason postpartum depression is a thing, the body is going through a lot of hormonal changes. On top of that, there's the stigma surrounding teen pregnancies, which is likely to result in intense shame, bullying and discrimination, only exacerbating things. Add to all this the very nature of forcing a teen to go through all of this, and we can see just how important the ruling was in preventing harm to so many people, including young girls. Yet that's only half the picture when it comes to contraception, with hormonal birth control being used off-label to help people with wombs suffering issues such as cramping and acne. Cramping in particular can be debilitating, preventing girls, trans boys and non-binary folk from participating in day-to-day life, ostracizing them from the rest of society by making them unable to participate in social events. Sadly, many can't opt out of school, meaning they'll be forced to suffer in crowded classrooms that only amplify their pain, whilst any flagging grades brought about by their agony will be written off as a result of their own laziness or weakness. This can have a massive impact on both their sense of self-worth, as well as their future education and employment opportunities, compounding on already existing misogynistic and transphobic discrimination. These are just a few of the ways in which hormonal birth control can and does improve the lives of so many young folk, mostly young girls, not only sparing them from debilitating pain, but giving them a fighting chance against systemic inequality. It's also important to remember that the general nature of this ruling enables so much more than simple contraception. For example, it allowed minors to seek abortions when needed without parental consent, which is particularly important for youth in religious households like that of Mrs. Gillick. As such, Gillick competence is acknowledged as a feminist standard, giving young folk, including young girls, autonomy over their bodies so long as they display sufficient understanding. And yet, this is how Ms. Keen talks about Gillick following the Court of Appeal ruling.
So, I'm particularly unhappy about that ruling. However, there are other routes to win this. So, my idea from now on is that maybe we need to repeal Gillick, or we need to re-examine. I just think Gillick is a law that was made for a really good reason. It was to stop pregnancy. So it was to stop quite a catastrophic, massive thing. Bringing another life into the world is not something that should have ever been allowed to be used anywhere else at all. And maybe it was the first step in dividing children from their families. I don't know. I don't know actually if all said and done, whether it's really a good thing. I don't know whose benefit, what other people have benefited from Gillick, but I'm just not comfortable with it. I think it really has been used badly here. Maybe it was always going to. Maybe that was, the thin end of the wedge. There's always a thin end of the wedge. There's always an unintended consequence. Maybe this is that we have decided that children really can consent. And I don't think they can. And I think actually we need to find other ways to stop teenage pregnancy.
Notice how, in spite of starting off by stating she believes Gillick was created for good reasons, Ms. Keen spends the rest of her time contradicting herself, concluding by telling us very bluntly that she doesn't believe someone under the age of 16 can ever consent to medical treatment regardless of whether they understand or not. So, the very thing that is Gillick competence. This discrepancy is the result of facade maintenance. Ms. Keen has set up shop pretending to be a feminist, so she can't come out and tell us how she actually feels, at least not without first hedging her statements. Gillick hasn't changed. The principle of allowing trans youth to consent is equally as valid as allowing youth with wombs to consent. Forcing a trans teen to endure the wrong puberty is something equally as traumatic as forcing a teen to endure pregnancy. It not only forces them into a body they despise, but will put many trans folk in a situation where they require multiple surgical procedures they wouldn't have needed if they'd been allowed to access puberty blockers. So Ms. Keen's problem isn't with how Gillick is being applied. Were that actually the case, she'd go after said misapplication. She actually despises Gillick altogether. That's why she deploys the Nazi dog whistle.
And maybe it was the first step in dividing children from their families.
This is something the likes of Stephen Yakesley Lennon would use whilst talking about the Nazi myth of the Great Replacement and how white households are allegedly being weakened by a Jewish shadow state. That may sound like reaching, but you have to remember that so-called gender-critical ideology includes anti-Semitic conspiracies about Jewish billionaires transing our children, particularly our white girls, who must be protected to ensure the proliferation of the white race. That's why people like Ms. Keen talk so much about fertility and lost wombs, because their ideology is built on treating women like breeding stock. That's how you can tell Ms. Keen's claims to support abortion access are complete bullshit. Sure, her pretense to support abortion is useful with the whole narrative she's constructed, but she'll flip at the first available opportunity and present white abortion as an atrocity that must be stopped the first opportunity she sees. Because that's what fascists like Ms. Keen do. That and the fact that one of the lawyers working alongside Bell was Paul Conrave, pictured on the left, a Christian zealot who has made it his career arguing that women can never consent to an abortion. Indeed, following the ruling, he went on to make the very same arguments as Miss Keen's, stating that, quote, "We are both dismayed and surprised at the Court of Appeal's decision, which appears to us the epitome of the triumph of legal formalism over justice and common sense. At a stroke, the court's decision removes a sensible, necessary, and proportionate protection for vulnerable young children against the poorly evidenced treatment with lifelong irreversible consequences, which is practiced by the GIDS service at the Tavistock. At the same time, the judgment demonstrates that the Gillick competency test is no longer fit for purpose. We shall be seeking permission to appeal to the Supreme Court." End quote. This is who Miss Keen is vocally supporting, an avid anti-abortionist. So hopefully as more people see clips like these being shared on social media, it will key some of them into what the real end goal is for Miss Keen. That she's not here to protect women, she's here to subjugate them whilst terrorising trans folk. We already saw the rift caused a few years back by her hanging out with vocal Nazis. Here's hoping that continues. Though, what do you think? Is this a smoking gun that'll bring everything crashing down around Miss Keen? Do you think she's created enough of a cult-like following to survive such an outing? Do you ever think Miss Keen will go away? Did I miss something you noticed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Just know that abuse won't make it through. As an interesting update to this whole story, a peer-reviewed journal article published in Pediatrics came out this month displaying how 90%, an overwhelming majority of trans youth, displayed a comprehensive understanding of puberty blockers via 2 separate measures. What's more is, age wasn't an indicator of comprehension for its sample, which included trans youth between 10 and 18 years of age. To me, this suggests environmental factors such as the amount of medical support and time the individual spends with a doctor might play a key role. So yeah, if you like what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gerrit Van Voorst, Cthulhu and Flynn. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.